Rita asked me to uh, talk about the current controversy about the name borderline personality disorder and should borderline personality disorder be renamed to trauma disorder. Now, as a matter of introduction, we all know that the scientific studies show that at least 6.5% of the Australian adults attract a diagnosis of at least one personality disorder, and about half of the people in mental health outpatient clinics tend to have a diagnosis of personality disorder. And in clinical settings and justice settings, child protection services, drug and alcohol services, family violence services, the prevalence is much higher. However, unfortunately, we are not being able to get recognition as a public health issue, which it should be. Of all the personality disorders, borderline personality disorder is the most commonly diagnosed. In fact, it is 99% of the diagnosis of a personality disorder tends to be for borderline personality disorder. This is across the globe, and it is certainly true for Australia. And certainly, when we talk in terms of severe personality disorder, we are actually referring to borderline personality disorder. Now, borderline personality disorder attracts a significant suicide rate of 10%. And studies show that when someone has the lifespan of a person with borderline personality disorder can be reduced by 20 years when compared to other Australians if adequate interventions, adequate treatments are not made available. We know that psychological treatments absolutely work, but medicines and other biological treatments don't work for people with borderline personality disorder. And most people with borderline personality disorder can achieve remission, and many people can recover. The prevalence of borderline personality disorder is 1% in the population. And when we look at the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's about 3.9 to 5.6% of people who have been exposed to trauma. And the newly launched diagnosis of complex PTSD, the prevalence is still being worked out, but it has been reported that it can range anywhere from 0.5 to 7.7% in the general population. Now, complex post-traumatic stress disorder has been known and discussed in the literature since 1980s. However, only since January 1st this year, it has become an official diagnosis in the International Classification of Diseases 11th edition. That's the World Health Organization classification system. And still it is not in the DSM, but in International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11 has recognized complex post-traumatic stress disorder as a separate diagnosis to personality disorder. So in ICD-11, people can diagnose someone with personality disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there is a significant overlap between borderline personality disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, half of the people with borderline personality disorder will also have a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. However, when you look at the complex post-traumatic stress disorder population, only 8% of them will have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder co-occurring. So when it comes to PTSD, slightly different figures. PTSD and borderline personality disorder, they co-occur commonly. The prevalence of PTSD in borderline personality disorder samples are up to 30 to 60%. The prevalence of BPD in PTSD samples is about 35%. So trauma could be, in PTSD population, trauma can be during childhood or during adulthood. So with this background, the question for us is borderline personality disorder the right name? My strongest opinion is that it is not an appropriate name at all. But we are stuck with that name. And what do we do about it? Why BPD is not the right name? First of all, there is a significant amount of stigma embedded within the name. When we call it as a personality disorder, it is going to be very difficult to delineate personality disorder from personality. So what we say in science is that personality is you, but personality disorder is what you have or what you have developed. But that's a difficult sell. And if you look at the basics of the definition of personality disorder, we say that a personality disorder is one which is maladaptive, inflexible pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving that is outside of the individual's background, such as culture, and usually starts during adolescence and endures right through the life. As you can see, I've highlighted a few words in red fonts to say that those aspects of the definition don't hold true. First of all, personality disorders can start at any age, not just during adolescence, although it is most commonly during adolescence. It is not enduring. If you treat, people go into remission and recovery. It is maladaptive, inflexible. It need not be inflexible with treatment. So there are a lot of holes in the definition of personality disorder. Also, people associate borderline personality disorder with bad behavior, which obviously is not true. And clinicians, family, and friends often can associate borderline personality disorder with as a behavioral problem, meaning to say that the person has control over it, and person indulges in it deliberately and in a manipulative manner, which all of us know it is absolutely not true. And also, our legal frameworks have not caught up with the developments in science of bodily personality disorder. For example, our Mental Health Act uses a very blunt instrument and doesn't really adequately capture the nuanced challenges that people with bodily personality disorder have. And even within the legal system or in the child protection system, again, there is not a nuanced understanding of the predicament of people with bodily personality disorder. For all these reasons, I don't believe the name is right at all, and the person feels very stigmatized. And that commonly what I've seen in my practice is that people tend to blame themselves. Forget about others blaming them. People with borderline personality disorder tend to blame themselves because the name is borderline personality disorder. And also, I believe a lot of the things what I'm going to say is my personal opinion, my take on the literature and the science, because this is not there's no final word which has been said on this matter. Also, I believe that there is very little of personality disorder within borderline personality disorder, because borderline personality disorder is unlike any other mental illness, and also borderline personality disorder is unlike any other personality disorder. And the label of a personality disorder doesn't seem to fit with the concept of a personality disorder. Label of a borderline personality disorder doesn't seem to fit within the concept of personality disorder because it is treatable, late manifestations are well documented, and remission and recovery is possible. And there are significant biological reasons for causation of borderline personality disorder, such as genetics. We know that the emotional system, there's some abnormalities, and also there is another part of the brain called the insula, which actually comes in the way of people forming trust in the interpersonal context. Okay, let's look at the new classification system ICD-11. Within ICD-11, now we no longer are able to make different diagnosis of different types of personality disorders. That has been abolished. We only can make a diagnosis of personality disorder. And for if you want to talk about, let's say, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, we can only say personality disorder anancastia as a trait. Um, the only thing which has been retained within the ICD-11 is borderline pattern. So in the ICD-11, if you have to give a diagnosis, we would say personality disorder borderline pattern. Again, it doesn't really completely capture borderline personality disorder in the way we would want it to be. However, so there's a huge temptation for all of us to call it as a complex trauma disorder because trauma is very, very common in borderline personality disorder. So let's call it as a complex trauma disorder, or better still, complex PTSD. But my opinion is that it is a myth that borderline personality disorder is a trauma disorder. I'll try and explain to you why. Uh, we know that abuse is seen in two-thirds of the people with borderline personality disorder. However, nearly about 30% of people with BPD report no adverse childhood experiences. Also, many who have experienced child abuse do not go on to develop borderline personality disorder. And many people with BPD were not abused or maltreated as children. So, in that sense, there is a challenge there. So, what we can reasonably conclude in science currently is that trauma is a clearly risk factor for BPD. Trauma is very common, but not essential for the development of borderline personality disorder. So trauma, there is a correlation, but no causation. So trauma in the presence of biological predisposition may cause bodily personality disorder. I just want to quickly add, it doesn't ever mean to say that trauma is not important when you're working with someone with a bodily personality disorder. It is absolutely important. If someone can't do trauma work, they can't really work with someone with bodily personality disorder in most of the situations. Now, is complex PTSD can we replace BPD with complex PTSD? Unfortunately, not. What has happened in ICD-11 is that a chunk of the borderline personality disorder has been taken away as a new diagnosis. It is not replacing it. It is only a refinement of a part of the borderline personality disorder into complex PTSD. Now, to make a diagnosis of complex PTSD, first and foremost, people must have post-traumatic stress disorder. So it is post-traumatic stress disorder plus three other features. Those features are emotion dysregulation, interpersonal difficulties, and negative self-concept. So PTSD plus these three criteria, which we call it as disturbance of self-organization, is required to make a diagnosis of complex PTSD. As you can see, not everybody with the BPD will have PTSD. Therefore, we can't make a diagnosis of complex PTSD. And also, to make a diagnosis of complex PTSD, you only need those three criteria. But whereas to make a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, you need additional criteria. There is an overlap between complex PTSD and BPD when it comes to PTSD, because remember I told you that about 30 to 60% of people with BPD will also have PTSD, but 100% of people with complex PTSD will have PTSD because unless we have PTSD, we can't make a diagnosis of complex PTSD. When it comes to those three criteria, that is the disturbance of self-organization. Now, BPD, people with BPD can have those three difficulties, but people with complex PTSD will need to have those three difficulties. Okay, this is a way of trying to understand the differences between these three diagnoses: post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and borderline personality disorder. As you can see, there is an overlap between these three disorders. Also, there is no evidence-based treatments for complex post-traumatic stress disorder yet. Although there are a lot of treatments have been proposed, none of them are evidence-based. This is a recent research paper which is published this year, 2022, that is looking at the evidence for complex PTSD. As you can see, not a single meta-analysis of complex PTSD was even eligible for review. In summary, evidence base for treatment of complex PTSD is lacking. So we need to consider clinical wisdom and available literature to guide clinicians how to work with people who with BPD and complex PTSD when they co-occur, or when complex PTSD occurs on its own. So my question in this background is the debate about the name, changing the name, a distraction for the work that we are trying to do? Because we know that significant number of people with borderline personality disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, even to this day, are not able to access evidence-based treatments. So, us advocating for a change of name, is that a distraction? I'm not suggesting it is. These are some of the questions which have been raised. Does it confuse the funding bodies and politicians? Does it split the advocacy work that we do? So people currently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and have accessed care in the past, they feel cheated when we are talking about changing the name. And people with the symptoms of borderline personality disorder are losing the opportunity to get well. And as just discussed, the mortality, morbidity, all of those parameters are significantly high. Uh, so is that a distraction? That's a question for us. There have been alternative names proposed. One of them is emotionally unstable personality disorder that's been in ICD 10 for a while now, for a few years. Again, that did not stick. And also, not all people with borderline personality disorder have emotional instability as a core feature. Complex trauma disorder, the other name which has been proposed. Again, as I said earlier on, not everyone with BPD or trauma histories. Complex PTSD, it is not same as borderline personality disorder. These two are entirely two different diagnoses. So if I had my say, I would just call it after someone who has worked in the field, like Marsha Linehan. She is someone who has experienced borderline personality disorder herself. As all of us know, she came out in a Time magazine a few years ago, and she is one of the biggest contributors to the treatment of people with borderline personality disorder. Should we call it as a Linehan syndrome or Gunderson's syndrome? So some name rather to get to the controversy so that we can get on with the work of advocating for access to treatments. Now, a few questions. So that's about the name. Um, Rita also asked me to address some of the questions which has been sent to us uh, for me to respond. I will try and respond to a few of the questions. One of the questions was is there any research updates on borderline personality disorder for older populations? Certainly yes. Now we did a survey and found out that 10% of people above the age of 64 who live in residential care services in Victoria, they have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And we have also developed a borderline personality disorder in old age screening tool in Spectrum. And some of the risk factors that seem to be common for older population is when they retire or death of the spouse or moving into nursing home. These are the situations when the borderline personality disorder tends to be triggered if they already don't have one. Also, there was a question about supporting versus enabling. So when someone is working with a person with borderline personality disorder uh, in terms of caring or treatment, so should we take a supportive stance or should we be enabling the self agency? See, the brief answer is that we need to do both, but we need to know when to be supportive and when to be enabling. It's sort of a balancing act. So if we offer only support, then we know that the person with borderline personality disorder is not going to recover. But if you're only enabling, then the person with borderline personality can feel invalidated and might not be able to recover. So, in a sense, if you're looking at uh, the work, it is to be a driving instructor, teaching the person with borderline personality disorder to drive their life and manage their emotional system. Uh, so we need to be supportive, but we also need to be enabling. The next question that was posed to me was, could you, in your professional opinion, see borderline personality disorder being reclassified as a, a developmental disorder as a result of trauma? The brief answer is if you're calling it as a developmental disorder, is it a developmental disorder? Certainly, yes. Uh, by and large, a lot of the problems start during the developmental years. But as a result of trauma, we don't know. As I've illustrated in my slides, we know that trauma is a risk factor. Risk factor, yes, but not causation. That has not been established yet in science. So also there is a problem about how we define trauma. If we define trauma extremely broadly, then probably the answer is yes. But all in all, in my opinion, the label of a personality disorder itself is unlikely to survive into the future. And certainly, borderline personality disorder, the name will change in due course of time. That's just my guess. The next question is borderline personality disorder adapted behaviors that people are unconsciously aware of and have not learned emotional intelligence skills, and do people make their personality disorders into your lifestyle? This was the question given to me. uh, I, I don't think I completely understood the question. If the person who posed the question is participating in the meeting today, please feel free to clarify the question a little later. Uh, the way I have understood the question, I'll try and respond. I believe that BPD symptoms were adaptive at one stage, but they can become non-adaptive later on. So that's why they become symptoms. So if you're looking at someone negotiating through the challenges during, let's say, 10, 12, 13 years of age, uh, at that time, some of the things were adaptive. Uh, but later on, it can become non-adaptive. One example is the being extremely vigilant. If someone is experiencing significant invalidation or trauma, if that person is very vigilant, that's very understandable. In fact, they need to be vigilant. But if they're vigilant right through their life, even in situations where it is not traumatic or where it is not invalidating, then it can become less useful. Personal disorders becoming a lifestyle. Uh, one could one could argue that that's the way the person has developed. So, in that sense, it is difficult to um, say that the person was in some way responsible for that. The next question was about could could I advise for families when could I advise on how a family member can support a person with borderline personality disorder. I'm going to probably Rita Brown is more eminently qualified to answer that question, so I'll let Rita answer that question a little later. Next question is: can the void caused by childhood trauma ever truly be filled, or is it something that we will always face? Uh, I have uh, pondered about this question a lot. Uh, if I have to reflect back on the work, on my experience of working with people who have suffered significant trauma, uh, uh, my considered opinion, I know it is very controversial. I believe that void can be filled under the right circumstances and with long-term therapy. When I say long-term therapy, I'm not talking about even 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I'm talking about several years of therapy uh, of some sort. And a lot of healing needs to occur. I have been fortunate to have worked with people who have been able to fill the void and have report that they are leading successful and fulfilled lives. So I'm an optimist. So I believe that it is possible. However, if I have to differentiate the groups of people where it is relatively more possible and less possible, people with childhood attachment trauma tend to have more challenges in filling the void than even childhood abuse. So that's probably they both have slightly different outcomes. Before I conclude, I just want to reflect on the Spectrum's experience. At Spectrum, we more than 90% of the people who access treatments tend to have a history of significant and complex traumatization. Our treatments are trauma informed, often not trauma focused, but trauma informed. And 99% of the people have a diagnosis of BPD, and nearly two-thirds of them also qualify for complex PTSD as a co-occurring diagnosis. And more than 80% of the people achieve symptomatic recovery by 18 to 24 months of therapy. This includes BPD alone population, BPD and complex PTSD population. So in that sense, we feel optimistic that our treatments work not only for BPD, but also for complex PTSD. So, in summary, the nosology of BD, that is the classificatory system of BD, is still going through evolution. The science is still relatively young and new. Um, and complex PTSD and BPD are two distinctly different diagnoses, and there are biopsychosocial etiologies. So we can't really say one factor is responsible. And trauma is absolutely an important consideration in treatment. It is a risk factor, but may not be causative. I think that's what we know now. It is eminently treatable. Prognosis is good. Remission is the norm. Recovery can happens in two-thirds of the people. There's a lot of research happening in recovery science. So conclusion take-home message is that more research is needed to understand the treatment of complex PTSD and also treatment of BPD when it co-occurs with complex PTSD until more research is done. So we are best advised to treat borderline personality disorder with complex PTSD using treatment principles that are informed by both BPD science as well as trauma science, and, uh, and not really replace one with the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Sathya. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Sathya whilst we have the opportunity. Just bear in mind that this really isn't a forum to be answering individual personal questions. So if you could make them generic, please. I can't see that anyone is putting up their hand or indicating that they've got a question there, Sathya. So I'm hoping that you've answered everyone's questions.
Except one, Rita, which I passed it on to you.
Yes, I was letting people ask you questions first.
I know it's a very controversial thing. It's hard. So I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges we have. Uh, if it was possible for all of us to come up with a consensus name, at least a near consensus name, it would be easier. Uh, so far, we haven't been able to.
Mm.
This is, and also see the name change needs to happen at a global level. We can't just change it in Australia, but we can advocate for a change if we have one.
Mm. And I guess with just hearing about individual not organisation states changing the name without having everybody else on board with the name change actually really seems to be encouraging or promoting more stigma and discrimination as they're discharged to services that actually have no understanding about what this other diagnosis that the person has received is. And certainly hear a number of stories along that line.
Rita, Michael has put up his hand.
Yep. Michael?
Yeah. Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Sathya, for that. That was very interesting, as always, when you speak on this topic. I was just wondering, and I'm sure you've been asked this before, that if you change the name of a disorder, in a sense, you change the underlying concepts behind that disorder, and diagnosis drives treatment. Is this likely to change the way BPD has been treated, historically? I mean, would it, for instance, over time, invalidate Marcia Linehan's work?
Yeah, look, yeah, you're right that just because we change the name, the stigma discrimination is not going to change. The access to treatments are not going to change. So, see, essentially, on the ground, now, not much could change, but the people's perceptions could change. So, because right now, when someone calls it as a personal disorder, there is a misunderstanding that it is the person's own fault. Although we all know that it is not, but it has been difficult to message and sell and convince people unless they're educated adequately. So that might change. So suppose we call it as whatever let's say we call it as X. At least it is not blaming the person. and it moves away from blaming the person. To that extent, we might have achieved. And
Right.
also, I think I have come to a conclusion over the years that why are we actually not listening to the people with lived experience? Why are we actually
True.
why are we fighting against it? Why are we so attached to that label? Uh, and it's really that doesn't seem to make much sense to hold on. But see, if we don't improve the access to care, again over a period of time, people are going to stigmatize, discriminate, marginalize this patient population. It needs to both needs to happen together.
Yeah. So the real issue here is not so much the nature of the care; it's access to the care.
That's right.
Yeah.
Both really, and access to the right amount, right kind of care.
Yeah.
Karen.
I've heard people propose an alternative name, emotional dysregulation disorder. What do you think of that as an option? Does it describe it?
Not everybody with borderline personality disorder have emotional dysregulation. That's a challenge. So what about people who don't have emotional dysregulation, still have borderline personality disorder?
Yeah.
Unless again we see, like I showed you in the slide. Now, a part of the borderline personality disorder has been taken away as complex PTSD now. Maybe in the future we might, cut borderline personality disorder diagnosis into several parts, and a part of it is emotional dysregulation disorder, a part of it is complex PTSD, complex part of it is identity disorder. Who knows?
I'm wondering if there's any more questions. I'm aware that we're actually gone a little bit over time, but I know one of the questions that was asked was about how can families and other supporters help the person, best support the person with BPD. So for me, I think one of the prime, well, thanks for attending, Tash. And yep, I hope everything goes well. It is actually learning more about BPD, which can help us to better understand what the person's experiences are and to help everyone to maintain some sense of balance. So asking some questions, getting some support, reading some books, finding some valid information on the internet, information that is realistic and yet offering some hope and optimism, because we know that BPD is treatable. So also I encourage carers and others to think about the impact that supporting someone with BPD may have on you and the others close to you, and maybe trying to work out a little bit about why you tend to respond in particular ways, and maybe at times a different way that you can respond. Try and understand the intense distress that the person with BPD is experiencing and the underlying reasons why they may be reacting to you or to a situation in ways that to us may seem a little bit out of proportion. Wherever possible, be prepared to talk about BPD, because the more that you push it under the carpet, I think the more that you actually encourage that sense of stigma and discrimination. For me, a very basic step was to be able to offer a supportive and a non-judgmental environment for the person, and rather than looking at blaming them and feeling that they're manipulating me, to try and work out to be there for them, to be offering support in a way that's acknowledging that they're actually doing the best they can with the particular skill set that they have at the moment. Now, for me as well, that might be that I need to acknowledge that to myself that I am doing the best that I can, because I certainly know that sometimes I was in survival mode and may not have actually responded in a way that really was the most supportive. However, I too was doing the best I can. Now, I know for some people with BPD that might feel challenging, because that may feel as that you're invalidating the person or you're not supporting them. So, look, research is showing that when a person with BPD feels understood and their distress validated, the intensity of their emotions decreases. So whilst we may feel that we're the target of a particular behaviour or action, it's important to remember that the person is in intense emotional distress and may be unable to actually tell you how they're actually feeling. So, and it's also important to remember that you can't heal emotional wounds with logic. No matter how logical a solution may appear to us, the person is in emotional distress and they're unable to actually perceive our logic, and it is very, very much our perception. So look, I think I might wrap it up there. There's a lot of resources on the Foundation's website, which you're welcome to share, read and to share. And if you've got any particular questions, send me an email, I think would be best. So I'll just put my email in the chat box. And if there's any particular questions before I close the meeting, just please put them in the chat. Thanks, Lynn. So yes, so my email's in the chat. If you would like to be sending me a question, I'll try and answer it for you. Otherwise, I would like to thank everybody for attending today and for your contribution over the last 12 months. And I look forward to what the next 12 months will bring. And a special thank you to Sathya for your presentation, which just really clarifies some of the complexities of the current situation. And it's certainly really challenging to try and find that middle road where everyone feels heard and listened to. And thank you everyone for attending, and I'll call the meeting closed at 4:40.
Thank you.